I wrote this music by tracing leaves. I mean, not by hand, with a computer. I wouldn't want to actually interact with nature or anything. Anyway, the piece is called Leaf Loops. I wrote it back in 2016, and I started out by taking a picture of a leaf and manually tracing out its perimeter. I then saved the coordinates of that path to a text file and wrote a Python program to read that text file and make this truly stunning animation. Okay, but how exactly does that help us write a piece of music? Well, if you've seen my circle music videos, you'll remember that in that case, I mapped the distance from the center to the pitch of a stream of notes. Now, of course, Leaf Loops was written many years before making those videos, but it actually used the same principle, letting radial distance determine pitch. Like this. When the distance to the center of the leaf is longer, we get a lower pitch, and when it's shorter, we get a higher pitch. Of course, there are many ways to map distance to pitch. We can shift the pitches higher or lower. We can use a shallow slope, which clusters the pitches close together, or a steep slope, which spreads them far apart. And of course, the mapping can be more exotic too. But generally, I find simple linear or exponential functions work best, since they don't distort the shape that you're trying to sonify. Also, these graphs have actually been a bit of a lie, because I'm not really treating pitch as continuous. I've actually been snapping the pitches to the nearest half step, which means that the true graph is really that of a step function. If it were really a continuous linear function, it would sound a little wacky. But simply rounding to the nearest half step isn't the only option either. Why not round to a harmonic minor scale? Or a hexatonic scale? Or a Wendy Carlos alpha scale? Or we could just use a diatonic scale. Let's go with that for now. There's also the question of rhythm. I tried out a few different approaches to rhythm and ended up with a system where the notes play on the pointy bits, the places where the outer dot sharply changes direction. That said, the final piece ended up being based on a steady stream of notes, so I must have decided that it just worked better that way. Anyway, let's take a listen to a few leaves using a few of these different approaches. Okay, so this is cool, but is it really a piece of music? It's just an unchanging, never-ending loop, right? To make it into a real piece of music, we need macro structure, which is to say we need some kind of large-scale change or evolution. And at this stage of working on the piece, while puzzling over how to achieve an interesting macro structure, I came across this leaf. Or rather, I came across a picture of it on the internet. I didn't actually go outside or anything. Anyway, the squiggle you see in the middle is the winding path of a leaf miner, a kind of insect that nibbles its way through leaves, producing these distinctive patterns. This gave me an idea. Like the leaf miner, I needed to go on a 2-week leaf cleanse, eating nothing but foliage until I reached a creative breakthrough. No, my real idea was to have the central point move, slowly traversing the path of a leaf miner. That way, instead of staying the same forever, the distances, and therefore the melody, would subtly shift over time, giving the piece a sense of macro structure. Take a listen to how it evolves now. So, at this point, I had a basic structure for the piece. What remained was the details. And there were many. What kinds of instruments should play this? How should the harmony and musical texture evolve? What about articulation and phrasing? I had a working macro structure, but what about the microstructure? And, dare I say it, mesostructure? You know, it's worth mentioning at this point that this whole approach is often called a top-down approach to form. You start with the macro structure, and then work your way down to the details. But you can also use a bottom-up approach, where maybe you start with a seed of an idea and grow and develop it until it forms larger phrases or sections. I generally find that the two approaches have opposite challenges. With a top-down approach, you tend to start with an effective overall form, but the moment-to-moment details can end up kind of lacking. On the other hand, with a bottom-up approach, the service details are usually interesting, but the challenge lies in connecting your ideas and arranging them into a form which allows them to shine. There's also a third kind of hybrid approach, favored by my former teacher Curtis Rhodes, in which you both let the musical surface affect the form, and the form affect the musical surface. In many ways, this is the best of both worlds, but it requires a kind of creative courage. You have to be willing to sit in uncertainty, and sometimes you also have to be willing to give up on large-scale ideas that aren't working, or discard that beloved phrase that just isn't fitting into the overall form. Anyway, back to the leaf music. When I get to this point where I've got a generative process that outputs the whole piece from beginning to end, I generally have my code spit out the music notation and switch to working by hand. This way I can ensure that the musical details are interesting. And so that's exactly what I did here. What you're looking at right now is the raw output that I got from my leaf looping program. You can see that I chose to quantize it to 5/8 time, which must have struck me as a very loopy time signature. Also, the process of quantization somehow led the music to being made up of 2-note chords instead of a single melodic line. I don't remember anymore why that happened, but it made me think that the piece would work well as a duet for violin and viola. So I went about orchestrating the music, distributing the notes between the two instruments, adding phrasing and articulation, and trying to identify moments of greater or lesser tension that I could articulate with dynamics. And doing so, I felt a little bit like a sculptor. It's as though the initial generative process with the leaf contours was a way of generating a block of marble, which I was now taking my chisel to. I might see a shape and decide that this should be the hand, and this should be the head, and this protrusion over here should be the... well, you get the idea. The goal is to refine and enhance the shape that's already in the marble, but to not be too precious with it. Like, I remember at some point changing all of the F sharps to F naturals for an entire section of the music, just because that's what the music felt like it needed harmonically at that moment. I also did a significant amount of cutting, copying, and pasting to try to adjust the pacing of the music. And after all of that, the final piece started to sound like this. What do you think? Can you still hear the leafiness? Or at least feel some sort of common thread with the material that it came from? Even if you don't, I really like this way of writing music because the generative process often leads me to interesting and unfamiliar musical territory. Before writing this piece, I'd never really written something with this looping minimalist aesthetic, but that's just what the leaves demanded of me. They're just irrepressibly loopy. At the same time though, I think it's important not to be too attached to the purity of the process. Generative algorithms tend to focus on a fairly narrow range of musical parameters, such as pitch and note duration, and can have a certain rigidity to how they shape those parameters. Often what makes music enjoyable to listen to is the interaction of many different parameters or aspects of the music in a fluid, intuitive way. This is why, for the final piece to breathe, to have that sense of organic interdependence, I often find myself abandoning the algorithm at some point and approaching the music more manually. But, you know, that's just me. There are many ways to be a composer. By the way, you might have noticed this particular animation featured throughout the video, and it wasn't done by me. It's done by Steven Malinowski of the YouTube channel Smalin, using his music animation machine. In fact, the whole reason I'm making this video in the first place is because he reached out to me about making an animation of leaf loops, and I thought it might be nice to revisit the piece and kind of do a making of video. Anyway, to watch his animation and hear leaf loops from beginning to end, head over to his channel using the link in the description. Oh, and I know I promised a video about a musical Mobius strip a little while ago, It's taking a little longer than expected, but I have made a really cool 3D animation of it, which is up on my Patreon if you want to go check it out.